welcome
Sure.
Vasudev Vivekananda Nayak for this podcast, who is one of the most amazing personalities which I met in LinkedIn, because not all person will be able to give you a time slot in a Eastern time which is favorable for you. Not about that, it's also about the research which he has done. Biomaterials are something which is more phenomenally done these days, and all these research has been something more top notch in terms of involvement of AI and deep learning. But now this podcast is basically on getting an approach of what a mechanical engineer previously in his bachelor's did in his master's, and now as a PhD student, what's the actual difference which is going on in terms of research, in terms of mental, psychological, and also professional mindset of an student who comes from a mechanical background and yet working in a field which is something like biotechnology and biomaterials. I welcome Vasudev Vivekananda Nayak, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I there's a lot of research which is going on in terms of human abilities, and also building somebody as an human. It's something huge these days. You know, I just wanted to ask you this one question: was human life a simulation?
Uh, so honestly speaking, human life cannot very accurately be simulated. In any experiment, it cannot be ideally replicated. For example, what we do in biomaterials and biomimetics is basically we try to kind of make it a point to, have a study where you have a case where it's very similar but not, you have process parameters, you have something that's very similar in terms of its approach, but exactly the same as you would have probably in the actual human subject. Best example, let's say in cell work, you treat the cells as if they actually, if it's a human or if it's an animal cell, you basically treat them the same way. In theory, you might have, say for example, human cells might react to a certain drug or chemical differently when compared to something like an animal's cells. But yeah, all in all, human life basically cannot be simulated very accurately. We can try our best to kind of come very close to presenting our views and doing our research in a what we call. So, but yeah, it cannot be accurately simulated, very accurately simulated.
There is a lot of hubbub here and there saying that Neuralink is going to be the new disruption. There are no ways that human brains can never be connected in the future. What's your view on it? Elon Musk gave it, and a lot of speculations here and there that self-driving cars are going to use Neuralink and all these. What's your view on Neuralink?
Yeah, I mean, as long as you have visionaries who kind of, dream about technologies like this, anything is always possible. We've had research now, especially with COVID, where, we never expected drug delivery in less than a year. So disease outbreak was, I mean, in the world globally was somewhere around January. It started peaking in the month of March. April, we had test subjects for the vaccine, and now today, Pfizer and Moderna basically have a vaccine ready. So as long as you have visionaries, you always have, constant innovation, constant drive, and they basically motivate a lot of people to pursue, similar feats. So like I said, so if, like you said, Elon Musk is someone who probably, has a lot more to offer than what he already is probably doing. So if people like him and, they inspire others. So as long as you have that, and plus the resources, anything is possible, especially in today's world where science and technology is so advanced.
I always had this one question where how is it going to perform the human performance? Because it's been performed, like experiments are performed on rats or guinea pig or anything which is much more similar to a human being. And I just want to ask you this one question, like, whether it's biomaterial, biomimetics, or biotechnology, or any field. How are those technology going to disrupt human performance? As a matter of fact, like, how are they just going to get an human performance in an advanced fashion?
I'll give you an example of the research I'm currently working on. So that basically would highlight how this works. So if you look at a case where, say, for example, a human has a fracture, he probably was doing something, he fell down, his lower limb got fractured in some poor way. But the thing that's going on, until now, is that there's going to be a cast that'll be put on him, and if, for example, the fracture is too severe, they're going to put a titanium rod or stainless steel rod, and then basically the wound heals over time, and then the rod basically stays in the particular human for a prolonged duration of time, sometimes much more than what is anticipated. So with these new materials that we are developing, basically we implant certain bioceramics, and these bioceramics degrade over time. And as they degrade, they basically enhance bone growth much more than what traditional implants are capable of. So now you have a case where you don't have to go through that second surgery to have the implants removed. You have faster bone growth, and the patient is going to recover without any additional surgeries during the operation. So for example, if say the doctors decide that they don't want to use implants, they basically operate in another place, take out a little bit of bone, maybe from the pelvis, and then insert it into that position where there is a fracture, and that pelvis basically acts as a graft, and that basically solves the problem. So with these sort of new technologies that are getting developed, uh, there is a huge amount of enhancement that's happening, in terms of material science and human health, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who wants to get into bioinformatics, bioprocess, biomimics, and a lot of other fields, which has
Right.
this cool technology where it involves human trials and all these things, drug development or anything. I just want to ask you this one question: where how difficult is it to analyze a problem statement, and how difficult is it to build for that purpose? Understanding the purpose is a main goal here, because there are a lot of biochemical, biomechanical aspects which come into the picture, like how to analyze it.
Right. This is actually a very good question. So first thing is, we have to see if there's a need for it. So is there a need for a particular research to be conducted, especially involving humans and human trials? Because if the research that is being done is in any way redundant, or if the cons outweigh the pros, there is basically no need of carrying out that research. I mean, that research could probably be used further on to develop, techniques or technology itself even further. But in the short term, that's not going to help a lot. So that's the first thing. So first thing is to see if there's a need for research. The second thing is the resources available. So discussing my problem statement, the first thing is if to see if you have the resources to carry out that particular trial. um, a lot of scientists and engineers face this common problem, is that they have a very good case study, they have a very good idea that they want to implement, they have all the sorts of guidance that they want in terms of getting that idea forward. But at the end of the day, when they want to execute that particular idea, there's a huge lack of resources. So that's another key thing, to kind of see if you have the resources, or if you can get the resources needed to start your trial. Second thing, when problem statement doesn't actually directly involve what I'm trying to say next, but it's always good to have a good team. So you have to also analyze what your team comprises of. So for example, if you have say a mechanical engineer, someone who studied biology, someone who's a doctor, someone who's a dentist, if a team is comprised of people who come from various different backgrounds, it gives you a lot more of an input as to whether your idea is going to work or not. So for example, if an engineer proposes I'm from biomedical background, so a lot of examples I give are going to be related through that. So if an engineer is going to give some sort of an idea to replace something that's existing, for example, in terms of exoskeleton design or something like that, it's usually passed through this huge list of people who are going to judge the project or who are going to give their inputs to you. And it's always better to have people who are knowledgeable in that field, but also people who are from different backgrounds. So then you get, and especially the background, for example, if you're going to do something in biomedical, it's usually better to ask doctors and physicians working in that field. So that's also very important. And the fourth thing is that you always have to have a clear picture of what your end goal is. And also you also have to diversify your research. So for example, if you're trying to aim for a particular goal in that particular research, you always have to have multiple objectives, because along the way you could end up finding something much different than what you were intending to, and that could be the lead to another research or another project. That's also very important. So for example, if you have say students working on a thesis, that's usually the case. What happens, they're working on a thesis, they end up finding a very interesting topic, they work on it, and in the course of that they end up developing these skills. It may be instrumental skills, it may be skills that they pick up related to programming or things like that. They usually end up learning a lot because they apply that heavily during their thesis. And as they do that, they start to think, and as they think, they develop these ideas which go on to become more projects, or maybe they pick it up as their dissertation for their higher studies, or something like that. So yeah, these are the key things. And also the other thing is, you always have to make sure that you you have the right people around you. This is not in terms of guidance. This is something like, for example, your advisor or your mentor, because they are the ones who kind of give you. They don't, so they need not judge your project, but they're the ones who are going to motivate you to improve on the existing ideas even more. Not the way that your peers would, but in a way where they would help you out further. So for example, best thing is, a student does his thesis, publishes it or whatever, and then the dissertation advisor or the thesis advisor is basically going to help the student to um, you know uh, further that research, in terms of, say for example, the student wants to work under the professor, they can apply for a grant with the professor, or what, something like that. So that's also very important, is to build connections, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, when you told about learning about the instrumental skills and also about the
Yeah.
programming aspects, how much has programming affected in your life? How much is programming effective? To reframe it, how much has programming affected or influenced your life in problem solving?
Okay, so we use a lot of softwares these days for a multitude of things. Everything is software based. So you have computer aided design, computer aided manufacturing, you have simulation tools. All of these things are basically either developed in C or Python. I mean, as an engineer of biomedical sciences, I do not directly apply Python and C in my day to day life, but I use software packages that are based on these. And what I can say is that they've simplified a lot of these processes very effectively. The best example is something, it's a software called Amira. And this is basically very similar to another software called Mimix, which is a 3D reconstruction software. And just to show you how useful it has become for us in a day-to-day perspective, is that, for example, if a patient comes in with a certain problem, that's intraoral, that's inside the mouth, there's an intraoral scanner which basically takes three-dimensional images of that particular location, and that is converted to something like a DICOM file, and we convert that into stereolithography file, STL, which is basically used for 3D printing. And those are analyzed in a software called Amira, or any sort of 3D reconstruction software that's heavily coded in Python. And it gives us information about surface area. It gives us information about things like what's the density of bone in that particular region. What's the amount of distance between one particular flap and the other flap between, because you'll have to put a graft in there. So there's all of these critical details that Amira can give you, and all of this is basically what is in Python or C. Amira is basically in Python, um, and this is how it's improved. And coming to the part where we manufacture or 3D print, it's all computational design. So we just have to know what kind of a graft that we want to use, um, and then we just model them using CAD. And that's basically the case with any manufacturing industry. I mean, any manufacturing industry uses a certain simulation tool or certain CAD design software that's basically uh, coded. And then it simplifies life to the point where anyone can use it. You don't have to be an engineer to use it. You can basically be anyone, and if you have the interest in picking up these skills, anyone can take up to reconstructing anything. So yeah, it's come to a point where it's very user friendly, and it helps us advance research even further.
Yeah, talking about this interest which you got, and also the way you talk about skills which you can develop when you are solving a problem statement. I always get this doubt, like you're a mechanical engineer, first of all, in your bachelor's, but why did you choose biomedical all of the sudden?
Um, okay, so there's a lot of reasons. So first thing is, as an engineer, you are always you're always taught to develop or to be creative, or to use your skills in a very effective way, to think different. That basically what you're taught. And then what I felt is that there's a huge need. I mean, I'm a mechanical engineer, as you said, but my main focus was in material science. Through my undergrad, even in my master's, a lot of the courses that I took were heavily focused on material science, because that's one of the fields that I'm particularly very interested in. Um, and if you look at a hype curve, any sort of a hype curve, you always have material science, in the emerging sector, um, and there's a huge potential in the future for material science. And it's something like AI and machine learning is for computer engineers and computer science majors, because material science is something that's got a huge potential for exploration, and that particular thing can be applied in any different field that you want. Coming to the part why I chose healthcare over any other field was because um, I always wanted to use my skills to advance, human health. And as an engineer, the best way to do it is through, things like biomaterials and biomimetics. Roboticists do it in a very different way. They develop exoskeletons. They developed limbed motion mechanisms and stuff like that. But as a material scientist, this is one of the ways that really captured my interest. The second thing is that at NYU, basically, when I ended up coming here, the main focus was that I wanted to work on composites. And there was a group at NYU, which is the Coelho Whitech group. Uh, it's a part of the NYU College of Dentistry and the NYU Langone School of Medicine. So this group was basically working on some composites when I ended up coming here. So I spoke to a lot of professors, and they basically guided me towards this lab, which I ended up joining, and now I'm a part of it. Um, so as I came here, since that was my main intention to work on composites, I ended up joining the lab, and I saw how there's a huge synergy between doctors and clinicians and medical professionals in general who were at that lab, and the engineers who were working with them. I saw how ideas were going from one person to the other uh, without any sort of uh, a clash. They used to complement each other basically, um, and that's where I saw engineers actually putting forward technologies that can advance healthcare, and that was something that really caught my attention. So I spent a couple more months there. I tried to learn a couple of things in anatomy, biology, um, and what really you know uh, raised my expectations about that lab was basically how dynamic it was. So all of the credit that goes for my shifting of major was because of the lab. Uh, because you know how you have these points in life where you come across a certain person or a certain group of people, and they basically change the way you think. This is basically what happened. So as I spent more and more days there, I found how research is being advanced every single day, and how thorough they are in whatever they do. And you can look up any sort of paper that we've published, and every single journal is an addition to what happened before it. It's Every single publication was thoroughly executed. um, and every single paper that was published was cutting edge research. So that basically coupled with the fact that actually wanted to be a doctor when I was in India, but unfortunately I couldn't. So this is another way of me trying to get into the healthcare industry as an engineer, but that's another thing. And here, to be very honest with you, as a university, NYU is very well equipped in terms of the medical uh, industry. I mean, they have the NYU School of Medicine, which is a part of NYU Grossman School of that's basically, so it's NYU Grossman School of Medicine, which is NYU Langone Health, which is basically the hospital, and that's ranked number 4 in the world. So in research and research output, and basically overall clinical care. So working in such kind of a place, it really opens doors for you, and it also shows you what's you know what NYU is capable of. You kind of see it, and then that basically inspires you.
Talking about inspiration, there is a lot and lot of scope in which biomedical research is going on in a new way. You know, probably if you take the problem statements which were like 5 years before, are not the same problem statements that we have today. Like, I always had this question for all the doctors, all the engineers, like any podcast, every podcast I almost ask this question: what's what's the way in approaching a problem statement in your field, and also is it different from getting from theoretical proof to the practical results in the lab?
So the way the problem is formulated remains kind of the same, like I went over it with you a couple of minutes ago. I mean, you definitely have a need, you have an idea, you have to have the right resources to propel that idea forward, and a very set goal that you want to achieve. And then as you go through it, you kind of diversify and find new ideas to pursue related to that. And coming to the point where how it's different, it's definitely different. Doing something theoretically is very different from doing something experimentally, or hands on, I would say. So the way it's different, especially in our case, is theoretically you have a lot of assumptions that you can make, especially in things like material science and biomaterials in general, or medical engineering. A lot of assumptions can be made. An assumption may be theoretically in your model, uh, or things like that. But when you do it experimentally, that's when you actually see it work, or don't when you don't see it work. That's when you actually get feedback from what you've done. The way it's so The best example, like I was telling you at the start of the interview, was in cell work, for example. uh, when you're dealing with life, it's very unpredictable. uh, so the best example is something like, you go into the lab today, you see your cells are doing well in any particular experiment. You go back the next day, and then something's happened. You don't know what's happened. There's some sort of a contamination, maybe some sort of an infection that's happened in the cells. And the whole cells are like, they're dying. So I'm just giving a very very brief example. So it's things like these you don't account for when you're formulating your idea, or you don't expect these things to happen. These are unforeseen. So In experimental methods, you always have these unforeseen circumstances that could happen, and that's basically how it's a lot different than the theoretical techniques. I mean, and another one is finite elements. So, for example, you have finite element simulations that are helping industries in you know in a multitude of ways. That's basically a numerical approach, and that is heavily based on assumptions, and that gives you a very good estimate of what could be, say, maximum stress in a material or something like that. But when you actually test it out, it could be the same, but it could also be a little higher or lower than what you were expecting. So that's basically very evident when, for example, you're testing out these implants, say, in a vertebral column. So say a patient has a sort of a defect in their vertebral column, and they have implants in them, and you want to do a test where you pull out these implants to see what the strength of the implant is. Say that's a project, and you want to simulate that in finite element analysis. There's a lot of factors that you could and cannot incorporate in that model, and the actual results that you get from your trials, the actual clinical trials, might be a little bit different.
Yeah, I know there are a lot of ways in which failures can happen, and thank you for
Exactly.
answering that question where failures can really be a part of your research at any given point of time. Probably
Yeah.
there is a span of 5 years which is given to you, but there can be research which can extend up to 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, or sometimes people end up giving their thesis defense at the 10th year. Probably they will end up with their thesis, everything. Probably in defense they might go wrong. Some things like those can happen also. Like, that's a huge way of dealing with failures. There can be a lot. I just want to ask you all these questions, how just given out this insight on how this problem statement is. I always wanted to ask this question to a biomedical researcher. You know, how much is the influence of nature and how much is the influence of nurture in your research? Nurture in the terms of there is a lot of environmental issues that might come, like when you said the cells might go under some sort of an infection, but like, how are you controlling it? How are you actually giving a suitable environment for it? That's what I wanted to ask. How is the influence of nature and the nurture in your research?
um, I mean, nature comprises of
Like, in terms of nature as in comparison, like you're trying to mimic and bio entity in some or the other way, like how is it getting influence from nature?
right. So as we discussed at the beginning of this thing, so you said, simulation, can you actually simulate human life or life in general? So this is basically, I would say it's very similar to that. So you can simulate what we call in vitro techniques. In vitro basically means you are testing your experiment on cells, and you assume that they are going to do well or similar when they actually are put in humans. So are they, like I said, are they actually very accurately describing that process by performing work on cells, and do they actually get the same results if you were to do it on a human? It might, um, or it might not. That depends on what kind of experiment you're running. But what I'm trying to say is, it might not always be the case where you get similar results. And that's again very very well seen in today's COVID vaccine. And you always know that when it's a vaccine, it's always done, they always have to do a human trial before they can approve of a vaccine. So speaking of you said, if you were to take cell lines and work on that. So nature gives us these cells. So these cells are usually harvested from humans themselves. They undergo surgery, and that's how the cells are basically harvested. So we try our best to kind of simulate the environment by, say, maintaining it at like a certain temperature, providing it with nutrients in a different way. So for example, when it's human, you're not going to inject nutrients into yourself. You're going to eat, and the nutrients are absorbed from what you eat. And whereas when you compare that to cells, you're adding certain supplements, like say fetal bovine serum, or some sort of antibacterial or antifungal agent into that flask where the cells are actually living. So you're trying to give the cells the same sort of care that you would give a patient, but in a very different way. So in a patient, you would give him food to eat. Here, the cells need different kind of food, which are supplementing it with some sort of protein and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, basically, it's a simulation of what you think might happen when when the experiment is actually conducted on a human. So that's basically the whole difference here. I mean, nature, the cells are basically derived from nature itself. But I think, to kind of rephrase your question, like nature gives you the cells, and you nurture them in a very different way, as if it was the same kind. I mean, you're trying to supplement it with a very different sort of an approach, but at the end, the result of that could be the same.
Yeah, there are a lot of ways in which you told about research which can be made in terms of nurture and the nature as an influence.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of ways in which people can misunderstand what your research is going on. You know, there are a lot
Right.
of ways in which people come up saying that okay, this is just a fake result or something or so, because sometimes when papers are written there are a lot of critics which says that okay, this is impossible or something. There are a lot of hyperparameters which we as an engineer, I'm an easy guy working. I work for computer vision also. I also develop Flutter applications. It's a long story short. There are a lot of things which can go wrong in the backend. Debug process can differ everything. How
Of
are
course.
these parameters like? How do you study the property of a synthesized material or a cell? That's what my question is all about. What are all those parameters that you look at? It's not like fracture point, which we used to have in our PU. We used to get it as a graph. Okay, then afterwards the tensile strength
Mhm.
is going to differ. It's a way more different in biomaterials. What are those parameters, and how do you measure the properties of a synthetic material or the cell?
Okay, so the first thing is biocompatibility. So you want to make sure that the material that you're using is actually going to help your cells or whatever grow. Uh, so there are some materials that are heavily biocompatible. Titanium is a very good example. Uh, these materials basically have to check off a lot of these parameters. Like they shouldn't corrode. They should support cells to grow on them. They should promote osseointegration, osteoconduction, things like that. So basically, that's the first thing. So the material that you're going to use, probably in any sort of a biomimetic application, should be biocompatible. Second thing to check that is to basically do the in vitro studies that I've been talking all over this podcast. That's the first thing to do. I mean, there's no other way to check for biocompatibility rather than to test them actually on cells. And so the other aspects are basically surface roughness. So surface roughness, surface profiles of these implants or materials can heavily influence their function within a human body or any sort of a model. And to assess these, we do a lot of profilometry experiments and stuff like that. Um, Another way where we kind of, so for example, you have developed a material, and you want to know you know what's in there, but you want to confirm what's in there. There's a lot, any materials engineer would kind of know this, but it's basically characterization, material characterization. That's probably through X-ray diffraction or some sort of Fourier transform, infraspectroscopy, scanning electron microscopy. And what this basically tells you is what I described before. So it gives you an idea of what's in the material. SEM, that scanning electron microscopy, could give you, surface textures, surface profiles, which heavily influence how the cells are going to behave. Cells like it when it's a certain profile. Uh, so and cells also like it when they're supplemented with say you're making an implant for bone. Cells love bone morphogenic protein. Cells love these sort of collagen derived products. So that's basically what we check for. So all this is through in vitro studies, a lot of assays we perform. So we do like say Presto Blue analysis, alkaline phosphatase assays, and what everybody knows now, PCR. That's basically what it is, a polymerase chain reaction. And now that everyone's doing a PCR test, everybody knows it's a PCR, but polymerase chain reaction is basically used heavily in biomaterials and biomimetics. Western blotting, which is again another form of analysis. So we do all of these, we quantify, and we also analyze to check to see if the material is actually biocompatible. And if you so this is basically the whole trend. But say for example you're developing a new material, you wouldn't know it's biocompatible. So for example, if you're going to design an implant from titanium, you don't have to do a lot of these things, because you know for a fact that titanium is biocompatible. Any form of a titanium would not be biocompatible. There's a certain composition of titanium, say titanium vanadium aluminum alloy or something that you're going to use is biocompatible, but generally titanium is considered biocompatible. But say for example you're developing a new material that you don't know is going to work. So the whole process would entail like all this stuff that I just discussed, uh, and it's also going to include a huge amount of materials science that's going to go behind it. And like you said, you would have seen like a diagram with some fracture point and all that. So how you would use that is basically, say you design an implant that you do with a new material. Your goals have to be something like it has to last inside the body for a certain amount of time. Say the implant is being used in someone's arm or someone's leg, it has to have that capacity to withstand the load. It has, say you're developing an implant for a tooth abutment, or you're developing a crown for your tooth using new materials. Say for example these days it's zirconia or composites of various kinds. So you have to test them out for fatigue life. So how easily do they get fatigued, or how long are they going to last with repeated chewing. So these graphs that we've learned previously, they
in our
probably did not mean a
pre-university.
lot back then. Yeah. So they probably did not mean a lot back then. But everything has a purpose, right? So for example, if you look at this, um, all these graphs now, if you were to analyze it in real life, they have huge implications. For example, just that graph with that fracture point probably didn't mean a lot back then, but if you were to analyze that in a real world application and plot the same kind of graph, will tell you a whole different story. For example, if you do some test on a new implant that you developed and you do the same tensile test or whatever test you do to get that fracture point, it can tell you a lot about what you've developed basically. uh, Say it fractures at a point where there's almost no load, or very low load had been applied and the material fractured, for a fact it can't be used in an application where uh, yeah, there's a huge amount of load, like in the limb or in the arm, something like that. So that basically is what it is. So a huge amount of materials characterization testing, and like I said, mechanical testing, and all that goes behind this, including in vitro testing to kind of synthesize a biomaterial and to deem it biocompatible basically.
Talking about biocompatibility, there are a lot of ways in which drug development is being influenced by stem cells. There are stem cells which are being used in terms of research, and there are ways in which people are coming out with new ways of testing it on a particular cell, then deploying it on some or the other aspects, like in a form of an oral ways. There are a lot of ways in which drugs have been developed, and there is a lot of ways in which they are trying to implement it. Sometimes proteins can't be digested, but yet they are given in a tablet form which can be converted from one form to the other. There are a lot of things which can happen in a drug development. Like, how is the influence of drug development from the biomaterials? Can you give us some insights about these?
Sure. So basically, the best way to describe this is, say, an infection, right? So you have a biomaterial that, say, you've implanted, right? And then uh, everything goes good. You're getting your treatment at a hospital. You go regularly for your checkups. They check it up. They see that it's okay, that you're doing fine, whatever. But a recent study showed about, I think, about 33-34% of the cases with implants in general, or any sort of a bone graft, they tend to get a lot of cases where bacterial infections are being uh, that are happening. So a lot of these cases have, these methicillin resistant strains of bacteria that basically they cause a lot of infection, inflammation, and then sometimes it also requires like the graft to be removed, bone to be removed, and basically causes a huge amount of medical costs, and obviously pain, and everything from the surgery and stuff like that. So this is one of the best examples. So if you look at bacterial infections, there's many ways to counteract bacterial infections using drugs in biomaterials. So you can either coat the biomaterial itself in a drug that's going to be an antibacterial. You can basically dip the graft before you implant the graft, and over time that there's going to be a release of antibacterial agents, and that's basically going to take care of the problem on its own. The second way, like you said, you could have tablets. There's going to be medication that's going to be given to you that's going to help you, not get an infection. Uh, but the main research, and especially that this is what I'm also working on right now, so I can actually give you an insight into this, is bioactive materials. So any sort of a material can be a bioactive material. It has to be obviously biocompatible, but you can have these ions basically of, say, silver or zinc, and these basically help prevent bacterial infection. There's a lot of mechanisms that go behind this sort of a process, but what basically happens is, instead of dipping the scaffold in an antibacterial agent, or having drug delivery through an injection or through tablets, is basically you make the material itself self capable of treating the bacterial infection. So these active ions that we incorporate within the material, they get released over time, so there's no additional process that's required to coat these in a certain antibacterial agent. So that is basically what is being done these days, as an alternate form of drug delivery. Another sort of drug, it's not a drug to cure sort of an infection, but basically enhance bone formation, is bone morphogenic protein, or BMP. Um, and a lot of these things, basically how they work is, they basically have some BMP present in that location where the implant is being placed, and it's approved by the FDA. A lot of FDA is the Food and Drugs Administration here in the US. Obviously, any sort of agency in any sort of a country has approved the use of BMP over the years. This basically helps enhance bone growth. So these are the various types of drugs that are available when you look at biomaterials in general. So yeah, I mean, huge amounts of applications and ways where drugs can actually be incorporated within. And also some research also has cells that are put into biomaterials. So for example, if it is a soft biomaterial, you can have cells that are inside the soft biomaterial. So you can load these say grafts or scaffolds with cells that are going to aid the process of say bone regeneration, or some sort of soft tissue regeneration. So that is another form. It's not a drug, but it's an enhancer of these biomaterials.
Yes, speaking about enhancers, there are a lot of ways that even enhancers can give out adversarial drug reaction, ADRs.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
if it's an overdose or something, there are a lot of things which can go wrong.
yeah.
Where you are not expecting this result to come out, but yet there are results which are unexpected at all to you. I just want to ask you this question: what's the secret mantra or that secret ingredient in your field in order to get the successful result?
There is no secret mantra in any field, to be honest with you. Uh, It's all about how you approach the problem. That basically is the way to go. In I mean, like I said, the secret mantra. There's According to me, I don't believe in something like a secret mantra. It's just hard work. It's the passion someone has for a particular field. It's the amount of
Dedication.
dedication that you have for that particular field. So some people, like I said, I don't do a lot of programming. So if you ask me something programming related, I'm just going to be, some other a person who hasn't heard of it at all. So it all depends on uh, what's the passion you have towards that field. And coming to something like biomaterials, like you said, what's the secret mantra? I would say, if you believe in something like a secret mantra, the best thing would be, constant trials. Any sort of medical research, you cannot just go with one particular solution and you just can't call it a day. Say, for example, you develop something, you test it out, and you publish it. People are not going to accept it. There's going to be a huge amount of review that's going to happen. They're going to give you immense amount of feedback. They're going to ask you to improve the process further. They're going to ask you to check, some other parameters that you wouldn't even have thought of. And then that applies to any field, to be honest with you. I mean, say for example, someone's in the aerospace industry, they're developing, a new sort of concept. It's going to get a huge amount of feedback. It's going to be developed further. It's going to be enhanced and enhanced and enhanced before it comes to the market. There's never been a case where, any sort of a product that's going to, be supplied to the masses is just approved first in the first trial. The same thing applies in biomaterials. Like couple of trials. Say if you're developing a new material, you test it out over and over for different properties. Different tests are being performed to assess different parameters. We vary the parameters slightly. We check to see if that improves or degrades whatever we're looking for. This process carries over like a multiple amount of times. Then we look for alternatives to the test that we've conducted. Say, you've done one test, it tells you some story. There's always different tests that can tell you the same story in a different way. I mean, the end result is going to be something different, but when you interpret the results, it's going to tell you the same thing. One test, for example, can tell you that cells are dying. Some other test can tell you that something similar is happening through some sort of an expression. uh, but at the end of the day, we conduct different tests, trials, and yeah, we kind of figure out where. So it basically is an optimization problem now. So we come to that point where it's an optimization problem. We try to vary the parameters. We try to see what gives us the optimum, say, talking about anything. I mean, any sort of product that's going to come out to the masses has to be optimized. That's a very broad term, optimization. But say for example, you're looking at one particular thing, one particular property in that biomaterial, anything. So that particular property has to be optimized. So that's basically what we do. And once we develop something, it's an optimization process until we get the results we need.
Yeah, it's all about optimization. Thank you for answering that. It became an topic where I can start discussing. It's not about also getting the right optimization tools. It's also not about getting the right algorithm in our field. Also, there is a lot of involvement of hardware and software. I just want to ask you this one question where it involves hardware as one aspect. How much has hardware influenced in your life? There's a lot of technology involved in biomedical research, and also a lot of engineering work is put into effectively getting in research. What do you feel that we still lack in getting the perfection of the actual human in terms of decision making, actuation, and also there are a lot of ways in which adaptation can be different because some people are allergic to cats, some people are allergic to dogs. There are a lot of things where medicine also can't even answer that. What's your approach in that?
So the first question is how hardware and software is. That's I'll stick with that first. So software, like we've discussed, I mean, it's obviously helping us out a lot. Hardware is basically what I would say is instrumentation, especially in any sort of medical field is instrumentation. So say ultrasounds or CT scans. That's basically hardware. I mean, at the end of the day, they're instruments, they're hardware. There's a huge amount of software in there as well, but basically it's hardware. There's an X-ray generator and there's a collector and stuff like that. Hardware, yes, 100%. I mean, if you look at the technology, maybe even 10 years ago to the ones we have now, all of these machines are a lot faster in what they do, a lot more accurate. For example, if you want to do rheological properties, there's a rheometer, the measure of flow and flow properties. So in a rheometer, you can have multiple things that it's going to give you, and over time it's gotten better and better. And at this point we have machines like say for example a rheometer that can give you very precise measurements. Same thing with like I said, everybody knows this is PCR. PCR was developed way back, and it's become like this chain, like this sort of like this gold standard. Uh, and it's been used over a lot of years now. But the main progress that's happening in this field is that the machines that are, helping you do these PCR tests, say a machine that quantifies the amount of RNA in a particular drop, that we call it for short nano drop. The amount of RNA that's inside this very small amount of fluid that you put. These hardware instruments are getting so sophisticated that they're so accurate that they can tell you things that you probably couldn't even have imagined if it's possible or not. So yeah, that's basically how hardware is kind of evolving, especially in the medical field, because uh, every field has a certain requirement in terms of accuracy. In aerospace industries, it might be, say, factor of safety. Factor of safety, when the airplane, say, is landing, the wheels have to have a certain factor of safety. Everything has a factor of safety, and with aerospace industry, this factor of safety is a lot higher when compared to, say, just automobile industries in general. Um, so that's probably a criteria that industry is kind of focusing on. In the biomedical industry and the medical industry in general, this accuracy of, say, these fluids that we work with are basically some microliters sometimes. And to have an instrument that can quantify something within that 1 microliter of the specimen that you end up using, it could be anything. I mean, I'm just giving you a very very vague answer, but say for example you're using something as small as 1 microliter, and say for a PCR test, that's a nose swab, right? So they put a tip inside your nose. They get a little bit of your a sample.
Sample.
Yeah, and they basically process it, and that basically tells them everything, that gives them whatever they need to know, and all they need is just one swab. That's all they need. Say saliva test, you just have to, say, spit in a tube, and you get I mean, here that's what's happening. Instead of a nasal swab, they're giving saliva test. So as you can see, the hardware is kind of now improving to a point where you have multiple ways you can get to the same solution. So nasal swab can do it. You can do a, saliva test, and you can get the same results. You can say if a person's COVID positive or negative. So yeah, I mean, then they do antibody tests. So the antibody test is basically a blood draw. So I mean, the technologies are improving to a point where the hardware basically is improving to a point where it's so accurate, and you only need just a little bit of something, especially in the medical industry, to get the output that you need. And that's basically what is driving a lot of these researches further. And the best example is something that's happening in our lab. It's actually not my lab that I work in, but it's the lab that is kind of in the same department. They're working on microfluidics. So microfluidics, they're developing the hardware for microfluidics. They're making these new cassette-like devices that needs only 1 drop of your blood to quantify. They give you a score from 0 to 100, and the higher your score is, the more likely is the chance that you're going to develop that particular disease. So, for example, if they're looking at heart disease, or they're looking at, say, for example, they can even do drug tests on them. The drug tests where they determine if you're taking drugs or not. It's microfluidics. So you can imagine it's come to a point of care diagnostics. So point of care diagnosis is basically where you don't need a lot of hardware. You only need it's just this small. It's like a little cassette that gives you your test results and gives you like a score, and you get to know if you're going to develop heart disease or if you're doing drugs or something like that. So yeah, hardware is improving to a point where it's come to say now point of care devices. And I think now IISc has developed like this take home COVID test, and you yourself can do it. All this has become possible. I mean, this is also kind of hardware. I mean, in the medical industry, this is basically what it is. So they've become so accurate and so easy to use, and that's improving a lot of aspects of biomedical engineering in general.
No, you're a mechanical engineer in bachelor's and master's. You took biomedical. Like, I just want to ask this
My
question.
master's actually was also in mechanical engineering, and my PhD is also in
For
mechanical engineering.
mechanical engineering,
But
but with an influence of biomedical.
yeah,
There
yeah,
is always an influence of biomedical from your masters, and I
yeah,
think probably your capstone project was also kind of similar to that. Yeah,
yes.
that's for sure. I learned about you. That's what I learned about you.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you this one question. What's the influence of GPU and CPU today in your life?
Okay, so as you would remember, I described Amira to be a software that we use. It could be any software, but just stick with that since I use it, and it's the question is related to me now. Um, so this particular software requires huge amount of CPU and GPU to run it. I mean, uh, we at this point we have computers in our lab which basically has I think it's not the fancier one with the 1.5 terabytes of RAM from Apple. I think it's something like 128 gigabytes of RAM and an Intel Xeon or something like that.
The Xeon
And
processor with
yeah,
Ryzen
multiple.
CPU.
It has multiple graphic cards, and it's got. I think it's the I think NVIDIA Titan or something with an SLI bridge or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I mean the systems are fancy, but
We use it
these
for gaming.
yeah, I mean generally used for gaming, but if you look at it in terms of how it being used for research, um, it's only possible the things we do because of GPU and CPU like that. These softwares cannot be run on something that we probably use on a day-to-day basis at home, unless you're at home you have something like this. But generally people don't have something like that at home. It's a double dual monitor with extremely high color accuracy and a high pixel count. The second, so that's one thing. So for Amira and stuff like that, which requires like huge amount of computation power, you need CPU and GPU like that. Another aspect is scanning electron microscopy, and that's this one field where I can give my insight on. So especially in this kind of a field, your hardware essentially has to be very good, because you capture these very high quality 4K images through the scanning electron microscope. And this requires very high processing power if you want to use that for something else. So say you want to do a fast Fourier transform on this image and quantify different parameters. Say for example you have um, these microparticles, say, in the SEM image, and you're zooming in at about say 50,000 times. So your scale right now, the if you're looking at a 4:4 ratio aspect ratio of an image, um, your your horizontal the scale could be something like 10 microns. So if you're looking at something that small, and then say for example you want to quantify what's the average size of these particles that you see in that particular frame, you have to do a lot of computations. You have to do like fast Fourier transform. You have to threshold this image. After thresholding, you're going to quantify all this area and stuff like that. So all this also requires a huge amount of hardware, CPU, GPU, and especially monitors have to be like very very good. They have to have like a very high color accuracy, very high
Refresh rates.
Exactly. And all of the monitors have, I think a lot of the monitors have 60 hertz. I think some also have 120 hertz. I'm not
120,
sure.
240 is available for the gaming because
I'm pretty sure no monitor has 240 hertz. It's either 60 hertz or the 120 hertz in
120
the one
hertz. No,
that I
no.
use.
For gaming, it's there are
Uh,
240 hertz which are available. You know,
yeah,
yeah. When you told about GPUs which you use and also SLI interface and everything,
yeah,
there's a mix and match of influence from other fields also. Deep learning, machine learning uses the same matrix computation which gaming computing had used.
right,
CPU was never thought about until NVIDIA came up with this
right,
architecture. And
right,
after NVIDIA coming up, gaming developed. After gaming started using this matrix multiplication, there is an involvement of GPU in deep learning and machine learning. There
right,
are a lot of ways in which computers also can make something wrong. There can be computational error, this and that. And also, when you do a lot of integer and the floating point operations, there are a lot of things which can happen, which
right.
which is that one influence that is giving you in order to get the right diagnosis right. That means, are the diagnosis tool that advanced, or else how far are we going towards an advanced diagnostic tool according to a biomedical aspirant who has to really look at what radiological scan has to be in the future? What's your keynote to those kind of people?
Okay, so this is again related to something that I also spoke about. So let's take CT scans, right? And CT scans, as they've been improving to the current technology that's available today, there's a huge amount of parameters that go behind a CT scan. You have the working voltage of the X-ray generator, you have the current that's applied to it, and stuff like that. And then the output, basically, if someone looks at a CT scan, they don't know what's happening behind the CT scan, right? They just look at the scan, they say, okay, whatever. The same thing goes with X-ray. So if someone's taking an X-ray, if, the end user, maybe a doctor or any sort of physician, is using the X-ray, if they know it, it's well and good, but a lot of people don't know what's happening behind the scenes. And so all of these machines basically have been improving like everything else, but there's a huge amount of parameters that go behind getting that one X-ray or one CT scan. So first thing is, like I said, working voltage and the current that's applied to the generator, the resolution of the scan. So how many? So for example, in a CT scan, say the scan starts from position 0, it goes to say position at 40 millimeters. So that 40 millimeters of travel that the generator and the collector are kind of traversing, each slice, basically a CT scan, you have a lot of slices. So each slice is about, it depends on what resolution that you're using. So some scans are very, very accurate. And some scans are, so for example, if you're doing a pilot scan, first scan, if you're doing, you usually do that, say, for example, in a very low resolution, which means that each step or each slice that the machine captures is a lot thicker. Whereas if you want to do a very fine scan, if you want your resolution to be very high, so each slice is going to be very, very thin. So that it could be something like 6 microns thin. So 40 millimeters divided by 6 microns, that's so many slices. And each one slice takes about, say, 5 minutes or 6 minutes to capture. And it captures everything inside, irrespective of what material it is, depending on, again, what kind of an X-ray source you're using. So basically, all of this translates into something where huge amount of, uh, say, GPU or CPU is required to kind of analyze this further. And that's like basically what I talked about before, like, using Amira and stuff like that. So these softwares basically read these slices one by one to kind of generate a 3D image for you. And that 3D image is then later on used to get other aspects. So for example, talking just in general about any sort of a product, say for example, you have a block of metal, and say for example, you have some defects in them. And these defects you want to say, for example, see inside in a CT scan. You can very easily see these defects, these holes, say for example, inside a metal block. Now, you can have a scan with like very thick slices, and you can miss scanning these holes, or you can have a very high resolution scan and you can capture these holes that are very small, so you can see how the hole kind of forms. And so yeah, I mean, you do need a fair amount of computing power and everything to kind of run these things and also to analyze these things further.
In terms of accuracy, yes, we need a lot of compute, that's for sure, because timing, the switching time of the transistor might also give you an adverse result at some given point of time. No, talking about all that, we have come to in conclusion that yes, biomedical, biomaterial, biomimics are just going to be as fine as in technology in order to give somebody and uh more plausibilistic way of getting the right diagnostic. That's for sure.
Yeah,
There
and
has been.
like I also discussed before, like I was telling about the point of care diagnostics, right? You don't need these complex machines for point of care diagnostics. Everything that you need is built inside that little cassette or some sort of form factor that's very small to use. The people can use it at their homes. So yeah, I mean, it's come to a point where it's like that. And also to add on, just it kind of slipped my mind, but I'm just putting it out there. In material science, there's a huge amount of machine learning that's happening right now. So if I can get like 5 more minutes, I think that would be great. I can
No, no,
actually.
no. I can. You can, sir.
Yeah. So basically, what's happening is like we have FEA now. You can basically simulate any sort of a thing, although not very exact. It's an approximation technique. It's a numerical based technique, so the results are going to be approximate. But they're using this technique, for example, say in crash tests. You don't have to do these crash tests these days. You can use FEA and simulate a crash test. If you talk about automobiles or something that's getting these 5 stars or 4 stars, you can simulate these results in FEA, finite element analysis. uh, However, like things are going even further now. For example, in materials now, you don't have to test out each and every material, and you don't have to do a finite element analysis. So they're using machine learning to predict if that particular material would break under certain sort of a stress, or some sort of if you're doing some sort of an experiment mechanical testing. So machine learning is predicting now, and there's a lot of research going on here at NYU, because that's where I'm at, so I can talk about it a little more. So I know a couple of labs that are working on this as well. So they're using machine learning to predict if these failure modes are going to occur and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, if you're a mechanical engineer who's working on this, and some mechanical engineers also working on this, obviously is a older field compared to everything else, but this is basically computation fluid dynamics, CFD. And stuff like that always require a huge amount of computation power, CPU, GPU. And yeah, if you've seen like these fancy videos of people simulating race car going with some sort of a flow of fluid over it, it's basically instead of going to a place to check this out, which is going to be inside of a um,
Wind
you know
tunnel or something.
they put it in a chamber, and then they simulate these conditions. Instead of doing that, people are doing FEA and kind of getting the same kind of outputs. This obviously requires a huge amount of computation power, because there you have mesh. So in FEA you have meshes, so you have to mesh your particular model. As these meshes get complicated, there's a huge amount of math behind them, obviously, but as these meshes get complicated, the amount of time it takes to solve this problem is also a lot higher, because a numerical approach, so there has to go over it a couple of times as well. So yeah, I mean, yeah, you do require huge CPU, GPU to be present.
Yeah, talking about GPUs and CPUs and bioinformatics, biomedical, and every other application. Stem cells is one such thing. Last question of this podcast that we are conducting today. Like, how far are we from printing realistic organoids from the stem cells? Your view on stem cells also.
Okay, so first thing is a lot of work is happening in this area. So there has been a lot of papers and reports of people actually developing this. You can read a lot about this, and you can find people are developing like hearts and stuff like that, pseudo, I mean, obviously so it's going to behave very similar to what a heart would do. But like I said in the first question, if you have a visionary, you can always have over the years. It need not be now. You can have the same thing maybe 4 or 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It is going to happen eventually, and that's where medical technology is going right now. With stem cells, with everything, not doesn't have to be just stem cells. With any sort of medical research, any research in general, it's going forward at a very fast rate. Uh, and again, like I highlighted before, the best example is the COVID vaccine. And I'm proud to be a scientist. To be very honest with you, it's just because of one of the things like this. People predicted 4 years for it to come out. So if you were to imagine, even now, I mean, even though the vaccine is out, it's not reached a lot of people. It's just come out, but still, you have millions of people who have died because of COVID, and at the same time, you have this light at the end of the tunnel where you know that there's a vaccine that's coming out. And until maybe even 6 months ago, people were saying that it's going to come out 4 years later, the vaccine and everything. But it's here, and it's making its mark, and soon everyone's going to get vaccinated, and within the end of maybe 2021 you'll have a lot safer environment, and probably we could go back to being maskless uh, out in public. So medical research and research in general is progressing very, very fast, and technology to support research is also progressing very fast, which helps us to get to that point where we need to be. So organoids, yes, there is a huge possibility, maybe in the near future, where it becomes a mainstream research area, like machine learning and AI is now. I mean, every single person is behind this. And if you look at, like I said, the hype curves, it's come to a point where it's peaked out now, and you can see, you can see ML and AI everywhere, from this smart speakers and stuff we have at home, with your lights and everything. So it's reached the common person. Um, but organoids and stuff like that are still being developed, so it's going to take quite some time. So just like any other biomaterial, they're just making their way towards getting approved, or towards a point where people can say that it is a reliable source of uh, research. And so people can actually now say that, okay, I can pursue something in this field. And it's slowly going to happen that in 10 years people are going to consider biomaterials and organoids and stuff like that to be mainstream research. um, but as I've seen so far, and as I've been working on these kind of things, not organoids, but implants and stuff like that. uh, and like I discussed, these bioactive materials, they are basically very similar to what you know uh, it's basically like having a living sort of material inside yourself. This material has a certain property that is kind of activated at a certain temperature. Say for example, if you so nowadays this also is happening, that people are developing shape memory alloys that are bioactive. So for example, an implant, so it's basically like a screw. A dental implant is basically like a screw. They would drill a hole inside your mandible, and they would basically put the implant in there, and then they would put the crown on top of that. So it would look like any teeth, that just like your other teeth, it would just look very similar to that. So in such kind of cases, if you look at in a broader perspective as grafts in general, before a surgery, a surgeon's gonna cut some piece of bone, put this graft inside, and then do whatever he has to do and suture it up, and 4 or 5 months later, there's gonna be some bone growth, and you're gonna be fine. Um, but during that surgery process, a surgeon has to do a lot of things. I just said, he just has to cut, but he has to do a lot more things to prep the material to go inside the body. And now people are developing shape memory alloys that can be activated at the point of surgery. So the surgeon can activate it. It could be a chemical activation process. It could be some sort of an electrical actuation. And this, so for example, if you have, say, there's one bone here and there's one bone here, and there's a gap between the two bones, and if the surgeon has to put a graft inside that, that defect or that hole, he could put a smart material and actuate, and it could just fill that space. So he need not do extra steps to get the same results as he would if he were to just use a normal material. So he can basically save a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it's not an organoid, but it's an active material, and its properties can be controlled through a certain actuation. So these materials are getting more and more advanced, and you can definitely, like you said, you can expect organoids to be developed in a lot of places very, very soon.
Oh, thank you so much, Vasudev sir. It was amazing
Mhm.
talking to you.
It's a pleasure to be here. I
And it
mean,
was,
if you have any other questions, you can definitely ask me. But yeah,
thank you so much. That's the end of it because it has demystified a lot of thoughts. There are a lot of things where biomedical research can answer a lot of problem statements today, whether directly or indirectly, but yet biomedical research can answer a lot of questions. Thank you for your time and an amazing podcast. I think probably from now on, if people are learning new things about biomedical and biotechnology, I think probably they can look at something of your research and they can start implementing something. And
of
thank you
course,
so much for sharing this amazing time with us. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, even though time slots differ, Eastern time, IST, but yet I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much, sir.
of course.